On June 1st, 1792, Kentucky officially became the 15th U.S. state. It was a significant milestone in the growth of the nation in that it was the first state, officially a Commonwealth, to be admitted to the Union west of the Appalachian Mountains. And yet the admission of this Commonwealth of irregular shape would lead to border disputes that would last for decades to come. The borders of the Bluegrass state are representative of the chaotic and irregular and sometimes contentious nature of the process of westward expansion. The first Virginia charter, granted by King James I of England, granted land rights to the Virginia Company, including royal title to Native American lands and the rights to establish settlements, but only 100 miles inland. But the land claim was extended in the Second Virginia Charter in 1609 to include all land west from sea to sea, meaning all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This land would encompass the modern state of Kentucky and, of course, much more, but not everyone, of course, agreed that the King of England had the right to grant those lands. The conflict called the French and Indian War, fought between 1754 and 1763, was largely fought between the British and French empires over the part of North America south of the Great Lakes but west of the Appalachian Mountains, called the Ohio Country. French defeat in that war settled the issue between the two European powers, but of course not with the native populations of these lands. The first claim to the part of the territory that is now called Kentucky during the British colonial period was in the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, signed between representatives of the British Crown and the Iroquois Confederacy. The treaty established a new line of property that both sides hoped would reduce conflict on the frontier. The land was further defined in the 1770 Treaty of Lochaber, which established the western boundary with the Cherokee. Originally, the territory open for settlement was organized as a Trans-Appalachian part of the colony of Virginia, with Botetourt County organized in 1770 and Fincastle County, with a border all the way to the Mississippi River, organized in 1772. Kentucky County was organized from Fincastle County by the Virginia legislature in 1776. The derivation of the name, first mentioned in English records as early as 1753, is a matter of dispute. While clearly derived from an indigenous language root, exactly which language is not clear. The U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs writes, origin and meaning controversial. Pioneer George Rogers Clark claimed the name was derived from the Indian word Kentucky, meaning meadowland. The claim is also made that it stems from the Shawnee word, meaning at the head of a river, inasmuch as they used the Kentucky River in traveling through the area. It is also claimed to stem from the Wyandot word Kintaten, meaning land of tomorrow. Also might have derived from the name of a Shawnee village and came to be applied to a tributary of the Ohio River from which the name of the territory might have been derived. A local story of dubious provenance has the name being a portmanteau of cane and turkeys. Incidentally, the nickname the Bluegrass State, and thus the genre bluegrass music, also has a surprising origin. The name refers to an abundance of grass in the central part of the state that can, in sunlight, look bluish-green, especially when in seed. However, Kentucky's famous bluegrass, that has the botanical name Poa anna, derived from a Greek word for fodder grass, is not actually native to Kentucky. The website of Oregon State University explains, because it is adapted to such a wide range of climates, you might think it is a native species. But like many of our grasses, Kentucky bluegrass arrived in North America along with traders and settlers from Europe. Brought by European settlers, the grass thrived in Kentucky's limestone soil and quickly spread throughout the state and, in fact, across much of the continent. The bluegrass of Kentucky proved to be ideal for raising horses, and it is that history that is likely commemorated in the nickname. The original borders of what were then counties of Virginia were defined by rivers and the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and thus have an irregular appearance. The Ohio River defined the northern border, separating the counties from the Northwest Territory, although Virginia's claim, based on its original colonial charter, to the low water mark on the northern shore of the Ohio River meant that the colony could claim control of all traffic on the river. The southern border, with what was then part of the colony of North Carolina and what would become the state of Tennessee, was a matter of long dispute. Trans-Appalachian Virginia saw fighting on the frontier during the War for Independence, largely with native tribes aligned with the British, and sometimes involving legendary figures like Daniel Boone and George Rogers Clark. Victories there helped to bring an influx of settlers, although there was continued conflict with the native peoples. The growing population spurred a desire for separation and statehood. In the 1780s, a former Continental officer named James Wilkinson proposed separating Kentucky from Virginia, but rather than joining the Union of States, joining the Spanish Empire, which he argued would allow better negotiation of trade along the Mississippi River. Wilkinson failed, but Kentucky was able to negotiate an agreement to separate from Virginia in 1786, with the condition that Kentucky join the Union of States and assume a portion of Virginia's Revolutionary War debt. The agreement set the northern boundary at the Ohio River, and lands north of the Ohio were eventually organized into territories and then states in a series of land ordinances passed by Congress. Virginia was able to define terms, including the claim to all traffic on the Ohio River, because it had leverage. VirginiaPlaces.org explains, state officials were concerned that the new national government might declare pre-existing claims void and force people with Virginia-authorized land claims to repurchase their land, since the traditional Virginia pattern of transferring land to private ownership was inefficient and created excessive legal confusion. The promise of a future voluntary cessation of lands north of the Ohio River kept the Continental Congress from interfering with Virginia's management of Kentucky south of that river. Before agreeing to the establishment of a new state, Virginia had used its claims to the Northwest Territory as a bargaining chip to ensure the state retained control over the Kentucky District. In the cessation of the Northwest Territory, Virginia carefully defined its boundary as the low water mark on the northern shore of the Ohio River, not the middle of the river. That left Virginia in control of traffic on the entire Ohio River, just as Maryland had established title to the entire Potomac River. When Kentucky became an independent state, it inherited the claim of control to the low water mark on the northern shore of the Ohio River. This set the stage for Kentucky statehood. In his 1922 work, History of Kentucky, historian William Connolly noted that when the new national government under the Constitution came into existence, Kentucky's protection was one of the first considerations. On February 4, 1791, both houses of the national legislature authorized the admission of Kentucky. The Westerners were slow in preparing their constitution, and it wasn't until June 1792 that Kentucky became the 15th member of the Union. The website virginiaplaces.org explains that there were 10 conventions in Kentucky between 1784 and 1792 that debated the details and future organization of government. In 1792, the Congress made Kentucky the second new state to enter the federal union. Kentucky was a state that supported slavery, and its admission balanced the addition of Vermont in the north. As new territories and then states were organized and admitted, Kentucky would eventually border Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. These borders would bring up many disputes. One of the more interesting disputes predates the creation of the state. Virginia's agreement used the exterior boundaries unchanged since Kentucky County was formed in 1772. To mark the boundary, in 1799, VirginiaPlaces.org explains, Kentucky and Virginia followed the time-honored process used for defining Virginia's boundaries. Each state appointed commissioners and surveyors. But even with a description of the boundary line, practically setting the line created challenges. VirginiaPlaces.org explains, in 1776, the Virginia General Assembly had defined the main or northeasterly branch of the Tug Fork as the Kentucky County line. When it came time to determine which stream qualified as the main or northeasterly branch to serve as the boundary between the states of Kentucky and Virginia, the 1799 surveyors and their commissioners made a judgment call. According to one report, the commissioners and surveyors met at the confluence of the Tug and Levisa forks of the Big Sandy River on October 13, 1799. The starting point of the Big Sandy River, the confluence of the Levisa Fork and the Tug Fork, is now the location of Louisa, Kentucky, and Fort Gay, West Virginia. Discussions that evening were mellowed by strong drink, during which the commissioners agreed that the Tug Fork was the larger tributary and thus the main branch. The officials of each state planned to sign documents to that effect the next morning. That night, a major rainstorm caused the Levisa Fork to rise, and in the morning it, rather than the Tug Fork, appeared to be the main or northeasterly branch. Despite the physical change, on October 14th, the true Kentuckians and Virginians agreed to ratify while sober what they had agreed to while drunk, and the Tug Fork was defined as the boundary line. In my experience, it's not always necessarily the best policy to ratify while sober that which you agreed to while drunk, but this agreement between Virginia and Kentucky raised what would become a continuing issue for the Commonwealth, whose borders are largely defined by rivers, because the course of rivers sometimes changes. That would become an issue that would rise all the way to the Supreme Court between Kentucky and the newly created state of Indiana, admitted on December 9, 1816. At issue was a river meander, meaning a bend or curve in the Ohio River. One such meander swings south, leaving a peninsula. Chief Justice John Marshall noted in the 1820 Supreme Court decision, "The people who inhabit the peninsula or island have always paid taxes to Indiana, voted in Indiana and been considered as within the jurisdiction, both while it was a territory and since it has become a state. The jurisdiction of Kentucky has never been extended over them. However, it turns out between them is ground over which the waters of the Ohio do not pass until the river has risen about 10 feet above its lowest state. That is, when the river runs high, it cuts off the peninsula at the top, making it, instead of a peninsula, an island in the Ohio River. Claiming the border to be the whole Ohio River, Kentucky made claim to the land, which it then leased, and the leasee then sued to evict the Indianans living there. In brief, the court decided that the boundary of the state of Kentucky extends only to low water mark on the western or northwestern sides of the Ohio River, and does not include a peninsula or island on the western or northwestern bank, separated from the mainland by a channel or bayou, which is filled with water only when the river rises above its banks, and is at other times dry. That is, the Kentucky claim to the Ohio is to the low water mark. The court also offered general advice. In great questions, which concern the boundaries of states where great natural boundaries are established in general terms, with a view to public convenience and the avoidance of controversy, we think the great object, where it can be distinctly perceived, ought not to be defeated by those technical perplexities which may sometimes influence contracts between individuals. These issues would continue. In 1890, Kentucky sued Indiana over a tract of land that then lay north of the Ohio River, but which they claimed was an island in the Ohio when Kentucky was made a state. The court ruled in favor of Kentucky, saying that the boundary should follow the low water mark on the north side of the river as it existed when Kentucky became a state in 1792. This meant that any natural changes to the river's course after that date did not affect the boundary. But the problem continued to vex the states. In 1980, Ohio sued Kentucky, arguing that the rules should follow a slew of other Supreme Court cases regarding accepted practices of accretion and avulsion. Thus, they argued the border should be the middle of the river. The court ruled that historical factors establish that the boundary is not the Ohio River, just as a boundary river, but is the northerly edge. Thus, the accepted rules of accretion and avulsion attended upon a wandering river that are applicable in customary situations involving river boundaries between states do not apply. But that did not settle the argument over exactly where the boundary was, a task that the court assigned to a special master. The issue was finally resolved by an agreement of the states in 1981, ending what the New York Times described as almost 2 centuries of dispute. A similar issue with Illinois arose in 1991, with the court again ruling that the boundary to be the low water mark on the northerly side of the Ohio River as it existed in the year 1792, rather than the river's northerly low water mark as it exists from time to time. And thus the unique status of Kentucky's Ohio River border took them to the Supreme Court 4 times between 1819 and 1991. Given how easily the border dispute was resolved in 1799, it makes you wonder if border disputes are better solved while drunk. Issues, however, at the southern border resulted from an entirely different problem. There, the border is not defined by meandering rivers. Rather, the royal charter between North Carolina and Virginia set the boundary at the parallel 36 degrees and 30 minutes north. It should be, simply, a straight line. But it turns out, in 1799, it was not easy to draw a straight line some 400 miles long. The Williamson County, Tennessee Herald explained. Most of the North Carolina-Virginia border was laid out in 1728. 21 years later, surveyors Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson, the father of President Thomas Jefferson, started where Byrd left off and made it about 10 miles east of present-day Bristol. In 1779, 2 teams of surveyors picked up where Fry and Jefferson had left off and drew the line all the way to where the Tennessee River flows north into Kentucky. Dr. Thomas Walker was one of those surveyors, which is why the line that these men laid out is still known as the Walker Line. But there was a problem. Walker failed to account for the variation of needle, meaning he didn't account for the difference between true north and magnetic north. As it turns out, the Herald writes, all these early surveyors mistakenly placed the boundary a distance of 5 to 12 miles north. So instead of the border between Kentucky/Virginia and Tennessee/North Carolina being at 3630, it is actually closer to 36 degrees 35 minutes in East Tennessee and as far north as 3641 at land between the lakes. Walker's error had stolen land from Kentucky. The Herald opines. It's easy for us to be smug about these inaccuracies in an era in which we can carry handheld satellite navigation devices. But if you think it is easy to calculate your exact location on the planet using a handheld sextant and a magnetic compass, you try it. But the error was realized. The website History of Campbell County, Tennessee explains, finding that the surveyors had made a mistake, Kentucky, in the opening years of the 19th century, sought a correction of the line and tried to reclaim the long, narrow strip held by Tennessee under the Walker Survey. This resulted in a dispute in which both state legislatures enacted laws giving them authority over the disputed land. History of Campbell County writes, Kentucky was irritated to the point of vigorously stating that the true line of 36 degrees 30 minutes was her south boundary. She sent her commissioners in 1819, Alexander and Munsell, to locate and mark that line. Tennessee was vehemently alarmed at losing the original property. The newly surveyed line would put Clarksville in Kentucky. The two established commissions, and in 1820 Kentucky agreed to use the Walker Line. The agreement was confirmed by the Supreme Court in the 1837 decision Poole versus Flieger. But there was an exception. In October 1818, General Andrew Jackson and former Kentucky Governor Isaac Shelby negotiated a series of treaties with the Chickasaw Nation. While there were accusations, including bribery and intrigue, the 1819 Treaty of Tuscaloosa was ratified by Congress, acquiring land west of the Tennessee River to the Mississippi. Commonly called the Jackson Purchase, the land was situated in both Kentucky and Tennessee. In Tennessee, it is generally known as West Tennessee. In Kentucky, it covers the area bounded by the Mississippi River to the west, the Ohio River to the north, and the Tennessee River to the east. But for the southern boundary, Kentucky insisted that the true 36-degree 30 north parallel be used. Thus, the portion of Kentucky between the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers has a border about 10 miles south of the rest of its southern border. But that isn't the only oddity. If you look very closely at the map, you'll see something odd at the bottom of Simpson County, Kentucky. You will find what PBS describes as a mysterious jog south before turning north again, forming a triangle shape dipping south into Tennessee. This odd border deviation is called the triangular jog. While it appears small on the map, it represents some 600 acres. The odd thing is, Nashville's WKRN News writes, the exact reason for the triangular jog remains a mystery. Perhaps, some argue, it is simply a measurement error, the result of navigating by sextant obscured by weather or a compass deviation caused by iron ore. Although WKRN writes, Dr. James Henry Snyder, president and CEO of the Simpson County Historical Society, said the most beloved story was that Sanford Duncan left whiskey barrels at a specific beech tree and told the surveyors, if the land up to this point stays in Kentucky, you can keep the whiskey. Whether by bribe or by error, the jog remains, leading to an interesting historical use for the land. The Lincoln-Pinch dueling grounds were named after the Lincoln-Pinch farm in the Notch. WKRN writes, Lincoln-Pinch was known as a piece in the Notch. Men could go for a duel, but not get in trouble because nobody knew which law enforcement ruled over the land. Future President of the Republic of Texas, Sam Houston, fought a duel there in 1826. But even the jog is irregular. That's because, according to a history blog called Sam Carey's Kentucky, a Robertson County, Tennessee settler named Middleton claimed that 101 acres of his property protruded into Kentucky and was properly part of Tennessee. Once again, surveyors were dispatched to the area in 1859 to settle the dispute. The surveyors agreed with Middleton and redo the line around his property, leaving a rectangular-shaped protrusion northward into Kentucky. But perhaps the oddest of the oddities of the Kentucky border is the odd spot called the Kentucky Bend. WorldAtlas.com explains, the Kentucky Bend is a part of a peninsula that is placed inside an oxbow loop meander of the Mississippi River. It is bounded in the east, west, and north by the Mississippi River and is surrounded by the U.S. states of Tennessee and Missouri. This odd anomaly was the result, the Atlas writes, of earthquakes that occurred in 1811 and 1812 that changed the course of the river. The area of the bend, covering some 17.5 square miles, has fertile soil, being on the Mississippi floodplain. At one point, the area produced cotton and had a population of some 300. The LA Times explained in 2002. The bend even had a small gin, a couple of sawmills, and also had a 6-decade-long feud between the Darnells and the Watsons, by some accounts over a horse or a cow, that Mark Twain mentioned in his 1883 memoir, Life on the Mississippi. Tennessee disputed the boundary until 1848 before giving up their claim. Today, the bend has just 9 residents, according to the 2020 census. The Times writes, visitors don't often come around what locals call Kentucky Bend, aside from an occasional escaped convict, a drunkard, or a hopelessly lost motorist. The series of river meanders and survey inaccuracies and border disputes that have defined the shape of the Commonwealth of Kentucky are perhaps as unique as Kentucky itself. And maybe they represent the challenges of growth on the American frontier. Kentucky is on that line between north and south, and at one point even defined the nation going west. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that the borders of what was once a wild frontier aren't exactly straight. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.